The Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. And they came over to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gadarenes. And when he came out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, one who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with foot shackles and chains, and the chains had been broken in two by him, and the foot shackles broken into pieces. Neither could any man subdue him. Night and day he was always in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus afar off, the man ran over and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, you Son of the Most High God? I charge you by God's name that you do not torment me." For Jesus said, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he pleaded with him greatly that he would not send him away out of the country. Now near to the mountains there was a great herd of swine feeding. And all the devils pleaded with him, saying, "Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them." And immediately Jesus gave them leave. And the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine. And the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea. They were about 2,000, and were drowned in the sea. Then those that fed the swine ran away and told the whole city and countryside about it. And they came out to see what was done. Then they came to Jesus, and to see the man that was possessed with the devil. And they saw the man that had the legion sitting clothed and in his right mind. So they were afraid. And those that saw it told them how it happened to the man that was possessed with the devil, and also concerning the swine. And they began to beg Jesus to leave their borders. Then as he boarded the ship, the man that had been possessed with the devil earnestly asked him to allow him to go with him. However, Jesus did not allow him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends, and tell them how the Lord has done great things for you, and has had compassion on you." So the man departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis how Jesus had done great things for him, and all men marveled. Then after Jesus had passed over by ship to the other side, many people gathered around him while he was near the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue named Jairus came. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him greatly, saying, "My little daughter lies near death. I beg you, come, lay your hands on her, that she may be healed and will live." So Jesus went with him, and many people followed him, and they crowded into him. And a certain woman came that had been bleeding out for 12 years. She had suffered many things under many doctors, and after spending all she had, there was no improvement, and her condition actually grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came and pressed in behind him and touched his robe. For she said, "If I can only touch his clothes, I will be whole." Then immediately the source of her bleeding dried up, and she could feel that her body was healed of that plague. Then Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that healing power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You can see the multitude crowding into you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked behind to see the woman that had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace, and be whole from your plague." While he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the ruler of the synagogue, saying, "Your daughter is dead. Why should you trouble the master any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the message, he says to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he allowed no man to follow him, except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then as he arrived at the house of the ruler of the synagogue, he sees the uproar and the people weeping and wailing greatly. And when he came in, he says to them, "Why are you going to all this trouble and weeping? The girl is not dead, but merely sleeps." Then they laughed him to scorn. But after he sent them all out, he took the girl's father and mother, and those with him, and entered the room where the girl was laying. Then he took the girl by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cuma," which being interpreted means, "Maiden, arise." And immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years old. And they were greatly astonished. Then he strictly ordered them that no man should know about it, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of John, chapter 6. And he went out from there and returned to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath day came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, Where did this man obtain these things? And what is this wisdom that was given to him, that even such mighty works are done by his hands? Isn't this the carpenter, Mary's son? Isn't he the brother of James and Joses, and of Judah and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they were displeased with him. But Jesus said to them, A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, and among his own relatives, and in his own house. So he could do no mighty work there, except he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went around through the villages teaching, and he called the 12 over to himself, and began to send them forth 2 by 2. And he gave them power over unclean spirits, and commanded them that they should take nothing for their journey except a staff only, no bag, no bread, or money in their pockets. But they were to wear only sandals, 1 coat, not 2. And he said to them, Wherever you go, remain in the house you are invited until you leave. Whoever will not receive you or hear you, shake the dust off the bottom of your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. Truthfully, I say, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city. So they went out and preached that men should repent. And they cast out many devils, and anointed with oil many that were sick, and healed them. And King Herod heard of Jesus, for his name had spread abroad. And he said, John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works are being seen from him. Others said, He is Elijah. And others said, He is a prophet, or like one of the prophets. Still, when Herod heard about it, he said, It is John whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. For Herod himself had sent forth and captured John, and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake. She was his brother Philip's wife that he had married. This was because John said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias had an angry dispute against him, and she would have him killed, but couldn't. Because Herod knew that John was a righteous and holy man, he feared him and watched over him. And whenever he heard him, he did many things and listened gladly. Then a convenient day came when Herod on his birthday made a supper for his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. That day the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, and this pleased Herod and everyone that sat with him. So the king said to the girl, Ask me for anything you like, and I will give it to you. And he swore to her, Whatever you ask from me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. So she went out and asked her mother, What should I ask for? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. Then immediately she came in and rushed over to the king and asked, saying, I would like you to give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Now the king was exceedingly grieved, but because of his oath and for the sake of those sitting with him, he would not deny her request. So immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head be brought. So the executioner went and beheaded him in prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard about it, they came and picked up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Now the apostles came together with Jesus and told him about everything they had done and taught. And he said to them, Come with me by yourselves to the desert place and rest for a while. For many people kept coming and going, and they had no leisure time, not even to eat. So they departed privately to the desert place by ship. But people saw them leaving, and many knew who he was. So they ran there on foot from all cities, and outrunning them, they gathered around him. Then when Jesus arrived, seeing so many people, he was moved with compassion for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Then, when the day was nearly over, his disciples came to him and said, This is a desert place, and it is late in the day. Send them away so they can go around the countryside and into the villages and buy bread for themselves. They have nothing to eat. He answered and said to them, You give them something to eat. And they said to him, Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread to feed them? He says to them, How many loaves do you have? Go and see. Once they knew, they said, 5 and 2 fishes. Then he commanded them to have everyone sit together in groups on the green grass. And they sat down in rows of hundreds and fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves. Then he gave the loaves to his disciples to set before them. Also, he divided the 2 fishes among them all. And they ate and were filled. And they took up the 12 baskets full of the fragments and the fishes. And those that ate from the loaves were about 5,000 people. After that, he immediately made his disciples get aboard the ship and go across to Bethsaida, while he stayed to send the people away. And after he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. And when the evening came, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw them rowing hard because the wind was against them. Then, about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they believed that it had been a spirit and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. So he immediately spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, I am, do not be afraid." Then he came over to them and boarded the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and wondered. For they had not even considered the miracle of the loaves, because their hearts were hardened. Then when they reached the other side, they came to the shore of the land of Gennesaret. And when they got off the ship, the people immediately knew who he was. So they came running from around the region. And they began carrying sick people on beds to where they heard he was. Wherever he entered into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets and pleaded with him to let them touch the edge of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 7. Then the Pharisees got together and came to him, along with certain scribes that had come from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, unwashed hands, they sought fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands often, observing the tradition of the elders. And after coming from the market, they do not eat till they have washed. And there were many other traditions they accepted and held to, such as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" And he answered and said to them, "Isaiah did well when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching doctrines and commandments of men.' For you are laying outside the commandment of God and holding on to the tradition of men, such as washing of pots and cups and many other things like it." And he said to them, "It is fitting that you would reject the commandment of God, so that you may keep your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses his father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, 'A man is excused if they say to his father or mother, "It is Korban," meaning, "Consider what I should have done for you as a gift to God instead." Then you never even allow him to do what he should for his father or his mother. Therefore you have made the word of God void through your tradition, which you have handed down. And you do many things like this." Then when he called all the people to him, he said, "Everyone listen to me and understand. None of the things outside a man's body can ever come in and defile him. Rather, it is what comes from within man himself that defiles the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." Then when he was in the house away from the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he says to them, "Are you without understanding like that also? Do you not understand that if anything comes from outside the man, it cannot defile him? These things do not enter his heart, but goes into his belly, and then comes back out just like all food does." Then he said, "The things that come from within the man, that is what defiles the man. For it is within the hearts of men that proceeds evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murder, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. All these things come from within and defile the man." Then he got up and departed from there and crossed into Tyre and Sidon. And he went into a house, preferring that nobody knew about it, but he couldn't hide. For a certain woman, whose young daughter had an unclean spirit, heard of him and came and fell at his feet. She was a Greek woman, a Syrophoenician by nation, and she pleaded with him to cast the devil out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not proper to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs." Then she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For such a saying, you may return home. The devil has come out of your daughter." Then she arrived at home and found the devil had gone, and her daughter was resting on the bed. And again, departing the borders of Tyre and Sidon, he came to the Sea of Galilee, crossing through the center of the region of Decapolis. Then they brought him someone that was deaf and had an impediment of speech, and they pleaded with him to put his hand on him. So he took him aside from the multitude, and put his fingers into his ear, and he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up into heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," meaning, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, and what had restrained his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then he ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more they would proclaim it everywhere. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. In those days there was a great multitude of people, and since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion on the multitude, because they have been with me for 3 days now, and have nothing to eat. If I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint on the way. For many traveled a long way to come here." And his disciples answered him, "From where can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. Then he commanded the people to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and broke and gave it to his disciples to set before them. So they set it before the people. And they had a few small fishes that he blessed, and commanded to also set them before them. So they ate and were filled. Afterwards they picked up the 7 baskets of the leftover broken food. And about 4,000 people had eaten, and he sent them on their way. And immediately he entered into the ship with his disciples, and came into the parts of Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees came out and began to question him, seeking for him to show them a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and says, "Why does this generation seek after a sign? Certainly I tell you, there will be no sign given to this generation." And he left them, and boarded the ship again, and departed for the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and they didn't have more than 1 loaf on the ship. And he charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It's because we have no bread?" When Jesus knew it, he said to them, "Why do you reason it's because you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts still hardened? Having eyes you do not see, and having ears you do not hear? Do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves among the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you pick up?" They said to him, 12. "And when it was the 7 loaves among the 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you pick up?" And they said, 7. Then he said to them, "How can it be that you do not understand?" Then he arrived in Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man to him, and pleaded with him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of town. Then when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, "I see men as trees walking." After that he put his hands on his eyes again, and made him look up, and he was restored, and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, "Do not go into the town, or tell anyone from the town about it." And Jesus went out, and his disciples, into the towns around Caesarea Philippi. Along the way he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say one of the prophets." And he says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers and said to him, "You are the Christ." and he charged them that they should tell no man about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, and by the chief priests and scribes, and that he will be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said these things openly, and so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And then he turned around and looked at his disciples and rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you do not desire the things of God, but the things of men." And when he had called the people to him with his disciples also, he said to them, "Anyone that wants to come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life will lose it, but whosoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel, they will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Therefore, anyone that will be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels."